2. Before I start, just to check, is the proposition team present?
Yeah, we're present.
Is the opposition team present?
Op is present.
All right, great. Before we start, just a few general reminders. First of all, speakers, please state your POI preference and preferred gender pronouns if comfortable before you start. And secondly, POIs are to be offered between the 1st and 7 minute. I'll try and put time cues in the chat at 1 minute, 7 minute, and 8 minutes. After 8 minutes and 15 seconds, I will stop taking notes. I think without further ado, I would like to invite the Prime Minister to open the debate here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, just one more thing. Before you start, could each team put their speaker lineup in the chat? That would be greatly appreciated. Thank you. In the meantime, could I get my panelists to introduce themselves?
Sure. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody, depending on the time zone. I'm Panchiro Catalina. I'm going to be one of the panelists for today's round.
Hi everyone, I'm Evan. I'll be the other panelist for this round. Good luck and congratulations for making it this far.
All right, great. I see that each team has put their speaker order in the chat. Without further ado, I'd like to call the Prime Minister to open the debate. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you
you're
are.
loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. So before I start my speech, I'd like to clarify, I'm okay with any pronouns, I don't really mind. As for POIs, feel free to just unmute and just POI me through voice because I might not be able to read the chat. And with that, yeah, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Now, given this motion, we assume that under this situation, the ICC has already failed these African states, which is why we on our side would prefer the ACC over the ICC, simply because it provides a myriad of other benefits, which cannot be attained when you are assuming that the ICC is doing is in control instead. So first of all, we first have to understand what are these two institutions exactly. So the ICC is mainly controlled by a US majority, which is also being influenced by the West. And under this situation, most of the guidelines are based on Western standards, which are essentially more radical in the eyes of an average African compared to that of the ACC. So under this situation, the ACC has a lesser distinction in their capabilities and economical aspect, in the sense that their incentive is to stop war and the African Union is there to promote peace and economic growth. So under this situation, they are trying to find an alternative for the ICC. And under the situation, they do in fact have an incentive to ensure better human rights in order to actually fight for this court in the first place. So moving on, under this situation, right, the current status quo has a lot of scrutiny towards the ICC, mainly due to the simple fact that the ICC is seen as a joke and also as a form of discrimination, given that under this situation, there's already been a lot of situations which have been which can be seen like favoring other sides and not that of the Africans. So why are they not able to leave right now? So under this situation, they don't have an alternative or a way to actually solve these war crimes. And under this situation, they are likely to leave in the future anyways, simply because the dissatisfaction will become stronger and stronger, and the government will have to end up responding to the calls on the ground. And moving on, it harms all the leaders constantly by getting constantly prosecuted, and the harms outweigh the benefits by them. And it feels like it's under the rule of colonialism, which is why under some time they will end up moving away from it in the long run. So first of all, moving on to my arguments. Number one, we say that it's principally unjust for these Western places to have this form of moral high ground over them to prosecute them. This only will end up breeding a white savior complex, and future neo-colonialism is going to assume these African nations as barbaric and less civilized countries, and somewhere that the white people should protect. And this is very obviously not the case. And this instead becomes very political instead of judicial, if being friends with the US means that you gain some form of benefit in the long run, which is something that we say should not happen, especially in a court setting. So when this is the case, the harms will kick in. and the people will become very dissatisfied on the ground. And this will also cause media to have the incentive to amplify these issues in the long run. And the governments may end up finding it hard to maintain the ICC due to this form of voter pressure, and they will be very likely to leave in the long run. And even if just 1 or 2 people leave, it means that like other vulnerable countries are going to end up subjected to the least of accountabilities. And when this is the situation, the counterfactual is better under our side, where instead it's going to be self-regulation, and it's going to be much more understanding in the sense that this union will be able to know what these countries truly want. And when that is the case, it's only going to bring the maximum amount of benefit compared to on the ICC side, where they're not even doing anything to necessarily help the situation in the long run. So number 2, in terms of practical benefits, it is going to be much better in regulating war crimes compared to that of the ICC. So given that this is an African country, right? This is an African-run court, there is going to be more incentive to actually follow these local contexts. And it's going like this court will have more of an understanding on the ground compared to that of the ICC. And besides just that, the ICC also has too high standards that don't take into account the different contexts and different nuances that will play into like the African court. And under this situation, right? What that means is that there is going to have a better platform to discuss these issues and move forward instead. And albeit the ICC being a dominant discussion for human rights, it all surrounds Western standards. Plus, there's lesser incentive for these African countries to join. However, given that there is going to be a tailor-made and more capable court put into place, which is the ICC, that is going to end up helping even more, because that means that these courts will be able to actively cater towards fighting for these human rights instead, and it doesn't have to just constantly pander to the West. So besides just that, if this court is if this ACC is in fact able to promote peace and whatnot, this ACC will be in fact be able to promote peace and stop war crimes simply because, one, it is in their incentive to protect their nation and to ensure peace and stability. Besides just that, it's also in terms of economical growth. And they can do this because different African nations are more likely to hold each other accountable, and they are most likely all tired of war. And people on the ground are also calling for it, and the dissatisfaction is growing in the long run. So what this discussion will look like in the long run is how to stop different war crimes from occurring. For example, stopping the usage of child soldiers, as well as how to move forward as the African Union as a whole. And this is exclusive simply because on opposition, people reject human rights discussions simply because it's going to be regarded as a Western complex and as Western propaganda. And this will only further fuel anti-Western sentiments even more. No, thank you. And what this means is it's only going to end up causing more harm within African nations itself. And when this is the case, it's only going to further strengthen that instability, whether or not it's only going to end up fracturing this nation as to whether their leader should ever have been prosecuted or not in the first place. And number 3, the ICC is also bad simply because it sets unrealistic standards for all these African countries to follow. And yes, before I move on, PY.
How is the ACC, even if impartial, able to carry out these rulings when they can't even take care of the crises happening under their jurisdiction, like the war in Ethiopia a few years ago?
Now, under this situation, we say that is exactly because they are unable to resolve these situations quickly, that the formation of a court is extremely needed simply because it's going to aid the fact that under the situation, what it lacks right now is a political system that is mandated by themselves. So with that, what we are able to do is we are able to solve these problems even quicker simply because we don't have to wait for a more Western superpower to actually take over this court and actually fight for that instead. So what this means is that we are able to work towards those goals even better, and we are able to solve those benefits even more solve those harms even more on our side. So basically what we have brought to you under our side in today's debate is that, one, the ICC isn't going to be doing anything anytime soon. They are only going to end up prosecuting these ACC without actually giving them a fair argumentation in the first place. And when this is the case, we need to find an alternative, and this is only on our side where we are able to gain this alternative to fix this principally unjust harm, as well as gain practical benefits in terms of regulating war crimes. And we have already told you as to why there's going to be an incentive to actually follow these courts in the long run, which is why we say that you should side with government. And with that, we are able to solve this problem even better on our side. And with that, I end my speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that fine speech. I'll now like to invite the Leader of Opposition to open the opposition case. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Could you try saying something again?
Hello.
You're audible.
Right. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. After I hear Proc's response to DLO's POI, I'm starting to question the legitimacy of their case because Proc can't even decide if they like the West or not. Proc tells you that anti-Western sentiment within Africa is a bad thing, but I have no idea if it's I have no idea why it's being amplified, why being amplified is necessarily dangerous, or whether or not this is justified for people in Africa to feel hatred towards the West, or whether they will feel hatred towards the West at all. Simply because your court is being tried, simply because your criminal cases are being tried by an international court doesn't mean that that court will be under the jurisdiction, not under the total control of the West. It's literally in the name, International Criminal Court. What does PROC even stand for? I'm still very confused. Right, but before that, 5 rebuttals towards PROC. Firstly, PROC asserts that the ICC is majority controlled by the US and also countries that are allied with the US. But I'm pretty sure that the US is not in the ICC and it does not hold any jurisdiction over any of the decisions made within the ICC. Second, ignoring that, right, they say that it's unjust for Western powers to hold the African Union or AU morally accountable because this breeds neo-colonialism and people are going to be dissatisfied. Therefore, it will fuel anti-Western sentiments within the countries. I really have no idea where this is getting to because I don't know why this will happen to the extent or to the extremes that neo-colonialism is likely to happen, given that countries that are persecuted by the ICC still retain their sovereignty. It's just that their governments are being held accountable for crimes that have happened within African nations. I think regardless, if you say that the ACC are going to trial these crimes anyway, and these leaders are going to be punished anyway, it's as long as you're being persecuted by a different government, according to your definition, it's colonialism. So by your definition, the ACC shouldn't exist either. So I'm very confused what this is supposed to accomplish. Third, you say that the ICC does nothing. But I think that given both sides have no idea what this motion is supposed to mean, and we have no prior knowledge of the criminal cases that caused African Union countries to be dissatisfied with the ICC, I don't think you can assert this, right? But the only thing that we can get based on the info side is that AU countries are dissatisfied with the ICC because they have done something, and that something is that AU countries do not like. And I think I'll continue with elaborating on that in my arguments. But fourth, they say that anti-Western sentiments within Africa are going to become worse, and somehow that's bad. But even if that happens, but that's unlikely to happen first, because unfortunately, the people on the ground in Africa mostly are unaware of these things, and they care more about being able to survive in the next day because of the various atrocities that these African countries are being tried for in the first place. But even for those countries that are peaceful and which have educated people who are aware about these things, they can't do much about it because many countries in Africa have flawed democratic systems or armed democracies themselves where people have little to no voice and can't voice out their anti-American sentiment in the first place, right? Fifthly, they tell you, I'll provide rebuttals against the effectiveness of the ACC, and this will be integrated in our arguments later. Right. So let's characterize the African Union before that. We tell you 3 things. First, the AU has no money. Second, the AU can't solve wars because for the past 18 years of it existing, it did little to nothing to solve all the different conflicts and crises that happen within their grounds. Thirdly, the AU has no incentive to care for the people because many African nations are divided, they have different goals and different motivations, and they are unlikely to side with each other seeing the conflicts. Right. How will we provide accountability, or what's the countermap on our side for the ICC? 3 things also. Firstly, the council must consist of a member from each state that's in the ICC, which will obviously include the 30 or so African states, which will make it more fair towards African countries to be able to voice their concerns, right? Second, courts have to be almost unanimous, which means, cause have to be unanimous, which means that you can't have a majority if there is a vocal minority that is opposing the decision that is made by the court to prevent Africa from having any more complaints. Third, we tell you that there's backlash in the status quo when it comes to unfair rulings. No, this looks like outrage from states involved, especially since they're already under heavy scrutiny, right? ICC is highly likely to act as impartially as possible because the eyes of the whole world are on them, and I don't think they want any more backlash to happen. Right, first substantive. Why impartiality in judgment is unachievable on their side? Why is the ACC unlikely to be a suitable arbitrator of justice? We give you 3 reasons. Firstly, the AU does not have enough power to have all their calls within the ACC be respected. The reason why international institutions hold so much power is because they are supported and comprised of states with significant political capital and influence over the international community, right? And they have a lot of funds. The way that they demand countries or member states to follow these rulings is things like sanctions, things like pulling out of free trade agreements. They all require having significant economic power in the first place and having lots of international support from allies. Otherwise, international institutions have no sway over condemning the countries that they're trying in their courts. Secondly, then, the AU in status quo is unable to control the situation in areas under their jurisdiction. This looks like having many ongoing wars and crises, like the war in Ethiopia that happened just last year. But because of this, not last year, a few years ago, but because of this, but the reaction to this is the lack of decisive and unified action. This looks like things like lack of sanctions to belligerent actors, right? Even if the military coup in Mali last year happened, sanctions placed by the AU did not stop the coup from overthrowing the government and setting up their own. This doesn't just highlight the ineffectivity of the AU, it highlights a divide. This means that the AU is unable to make impartial calls and that countries within the ACC are likely to serve their own self-interest and are unable to agree on a certain ruling. Thirdly, then, the AU has significantly less funds than the ICC. This ties into the first reason, which means that the AU can't really hold much control over the member states, especially when they are able to disobey them and trade with nations that are outside the African Union, right? But the AU is also dealing with economic crisis as well. This looks like, the hyperinflation in Nigeria. This looks like ICC. But however, on the other hand, the ICC comprised of many first world states like Canada and Germany, right? Due to them having more capital, they are better able to enforce punishments and capture belligerent leaders because they have the financial capital to do so. But yes, I'll take you.
If African nations are so messy and incapable, how are you able to attain the simple majority to be able to prosecute someone on your side of the house?
I just spent the entire speech telling you why that's not going to happen in the ACC either. Right. B, what would the counterfactual on prop look like then? The most likely counterfactual is that the AU cannot establish an ACC that's effective in rulings, right? For example, when crimes between African and non-African countries happen, the lack of impartiality in African countries necessarily means that when African countries or the member states of the ACC are going to be biased towards those African countries involved or biased against them if they're unpopular within the AU. Next, this also means that rulings will be completely ignored by the states in question, right? Because the ACC doesn't have much leverage in terms of economic prowess and influence. But let's, on their best case scenario, if everyone respects the rulings of the ACC and it proceeds, why is this still bad? This is because rulings are probably going to be very messy and slow to come about because I've just characterized to you why the AU is more likely to be divided than the international community. Further than that, hegemony is going to form. More on that later in second speaker's argumentation. Proud to oppose.
Thank you for that fine speech. I now like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the prop piece. Here.
Hi, I'll be speaking as TPM. I prefer my PLIs in chat unless I still haven't took one by the 6 minutes. Thank you. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Opposition characterized every African state as being incredibly messy, as being extremely impartial. However, as their only defense against against our arguments on why it is unfair against African nations is that you want to involve the leaders from every African state, and you need a majority or even all a consensus to be able to convict someone. If that is the case, we question the ability for opposition to also attain the ability to actually convict someone. These are questions the side of opposition need to argue, or they have no impacts either. If it is true that on both sides, African nations are impartial, and on both sides, no one can achieve anything anyway, we argue then the principles of Western people only or the international community only prosecuting African people are then something that there's always a net harm on their side of the house, and it's something that we can never stand for as a basis of justice. With that being said, I want to weigh a few issues in this debate. Firstly, then, on which side do we have better impartiality, which is a prominent push from side of opposition? Secondly, then, on which side can we solve war crimes better and tackle the issues better? And thirdly, then, let's take them at their best, that even if we cannot prosecute anyone, why is it still more harmful or on their side of the house? Firstly, then, let's talk about which side has better impartiality. I think there lack a bit of analysis coming from side of opposition to say why the international community is necessarily very impartial and always making the fairest and just decisions at all times. If you look at the info slide, it is obviously not impartial since only African people are being prosecuted and only these individuals are being put onto this. This is because the international community is then biased against African nations as a whole because of the virtue of them being poor and because of pre-existing narratives and because all of these people want to be able to establish the facade that they are trying to uphold international rights and they are the good people, therefore putting this vulnerable actor at the lower hand just for the benefits of them. We relate it to neocolonialism because these people, the African people, are the ones who are historically harmed, and for the benefits of the West and for other international communities, they are using this again to further jeopardize and harm and unjustly punish African nations. This is particularly harmful in terms of the principle if they want to argue impartiality. However, if we look at our side of the house, sure, maybe that there is some level of instability, maybe that African nations also might be impartial sometimes, but on the comparative that we are talking about, the relative difference in your economic ability in the African Union is then so much lesser than the economical difference in the international community. This means that you're still able to hold each other to check to a certain extent. This means that even if you hate each other, you're still able to get people to support you. This means that you can still have your coalition to a certain extent to be able to ensure check and balances. Whereas on the international community, if they want to argue impartiality as an absolute good, they have to defend why only African nations are being prosecuted where war crimes are happening everywhere. This is something they can never win. If their main case is impartiality, I think it is so much better on our side of the house. Secondly, then, let's talk about which side can we solve the issues better. I think in this debate, we have to assume that African nations, to some extent, want to solve these war crimes and want to move forward. This is because it benefits the economy. This is because it's better for the international image. And it's also then better for all leaders. If they then stop having these war crimes, it is better for the nation as a whole. If they do not care about solving war crimes, they wouldn't want to have the ACC in the first place. And if this debate operates on the basis that these leaders do not want to solve war crimes at all, the very likely scenario is to pull out of the ICC on the side of opposition, whereas on our side of the house, at least, we might still have the ACC after them pulling out of the ICC, even if at worst the ACC is less functional on our side of the house. So let's then engage on a most likely context where they are likely to want to solve the human rights issue to a certain extent. Opposition says that because the African nation is unstable, therefore you're unable to solve war crimes at all. I think there are a couple of reasons that I've already told you on why then they have the incentive to do so and to work together. The motive and the reason of why the African Union wants to exist is to promote stability, is to promote peace, because African nations notice that they cannot continue the economy if they keep fighting. This is the exact reason as to why they want to do so and have the incentive to do so. The reason why they're able to do so is because they have the capability when African nations are getting richer and richer and having more education within status quo. We see this within the success of the African Union when they're working together and trying to promote the economy. This is so much better than when they didn't have anything at all and dependent on the international community, which is the IMF, that harm them even more. But furthermore, we argue to you that this is more suitable towards the local context. We think that oftentimes the reason why countries do not have so much incentive to try to solve war crimes on a comparative is because it's not suitable for their local context. The international standards that they set are just unattainable because these African nations had been harmed from the start and they're still developing. What does this result in? This means that either one, they're likely to hide their war crimes even more on the side of opposition. Two, they will leave the ICC because they do not want to get prosecuted. Or three, they will try to use different strategies, such as being friends with stronger nations within the ICC, or being, for example, maybe friends with the US, because US has a lot of significant power within the international community, even if they're not within the ICC. This means that it is then significantly harder on the side of opposition, whereas the comparative is that we still have some incentive to try to move forward because of its attainability and pre-existing incentives, where that incentive is diminished on the side of opposition. But we also tell you that you have more support on the ground. Opposition questions, why is it harmful that you have anti-war sentiments? Why is it bad that people hate the ICC? Panel, this is bad because the ICC cannot be in a nation for all the times. They cannot have a soldier in every square feet of the African grounds. Oftentimes, how that you prosecute these leaders is when people on the ground are whistleblowers, when they report it to the ICC, when they have issues on the ground, when they want to make this issue noticed so that their leaders will be held accountable, so that they think that this is something that is best for their nations. But insofar as ICC is seen as something that targets the African Union, as something that frames the African as people who are quote unquote barbaric, or people who are less than the Western nations, which then already amplified. We've told you why the media has an incentive to amplify this, because oftentimes these are what causes what attracts the attention of people on the ground and are the hot topics that's happening within the status quo. News show that a lot of African nations are already voicing out against the ICC. This is exactly why, even if the ICC is so functional, it is really hard to catch real war crimes, because all of this do not have concrete evidence. It relies on witnesses on the ground. If you always question witnesses and people do not cooperate, opposition has to prove on their side of the house why you're being able to prosecute these leaders anyway, or else that case is only a tokenistic prosecution. But thirdly then, let's engage on the best case scenario, that what if we cannot prosecute individuals, that our standards will be significantly lower. I think that this is still better, because oftentimes when you prosecute so many individuals unjustly, you cause instability within the country. When too many people are being put in jail or being prosecuted, compared to on our side of the house, it will be relatively more suitable to the local context and according to the needs. This means that you cause political instability. When people question and split into the fractions on whether ICC is legitimate or not, when some people want to prosecute their leaders and some want to protect their leaders, the likelihood of a civil war or likelihood of conflict and instability is more likely on the side of opposition. But we also tell you that being able to discuss these issues and work away from them are so much better. Let's assume that we don't prosecute anyone, but we have lower standards as well. This means that they're able to talk about, for example, how to move forward better when they do have the risk of being prosecuted, assuming our worst case where they will not get prosecuted. This means that they can still work towards a better human rights in the future, and we posit you that this is still better. Panel, opposition has to deal with how they're going to prosecute these leaders when people do not cooperate. They have to deal with the moral harms of only African people being prosecuted. With that being said, we're really proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that great speech. To further the opposition case, I'd now like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to start I prefer my POIs verbally, and I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, and 1. It's quite unfortunate that proposition can't win with this case simply because it operates in a bubble of working together and building peace. But the African Union has been unable to achieve any of their goals, and that is a sad reality we need to talk about in this debate. A few responses before I go into my actual argumentation, right? They tell you largely 4 things. Number 1, that the international communities only prosecute African people, and that this is principally messed up. We tell you 2 things here. Number 1, that they're not like persecuting people, they're persecuting African countries in which they're involved. And secondly, then selective justice does not mean it's still not justice. It doesn't matter if this kind of justice is still selective, because the truth is like still there. These people committed war crimes, these people did bad things, and they still deserve to be persecuted. Sure, it is selective in the way they commit their justice, and it is something that we as the ICC would have to work on, but it still remains true that it is a form of justice, and people were still paying for real crimes that were really made. Secondly, when you talk about holding each other accountable in a triumvirate like situation like how they did with Caesar because of the smaller margin, we tell you number one, they're not likely to hold each other accountable. They're likely to go head to head. Why is this true? Because people, like we've already outlined to you, a divide in the African Union in the first place. There's no reason to hold each other accountable. They could be forming hegemonies, and like I'll explain it later, but they could be like forming hegemonies in the African Union, allying with each other, hiding their own crimes. There's no likelihood that they would be holding each other accountable, other than the one incentive that like proposition brought up to you, which is working together to create peace, which they've never proven why it is likely to be followed, and they've never proven and grounded it into this debate. Thirdly, on how they say the African Union wants to solve war crimes because it was built to promote stability and peace, and people want to work together. It may have been the reason that the African Union was formed, but the sad reality is they have been unable to achieve anything. Even in these even in the past 2 decades, they have still been multiple wars. They're still like facing an economic crisis, and so no matter how much they've been trying to work together, it is obviously not working because they simply do not have that kind of like economic prowess. They don't have the influence, nor do they have the stability you need to be able to work to this kind of like peace. To be able to work this kind of like peace and economic growth and success, because let's be real, Nigeria is still facing hyperinflation. People are still dying and unable to buy bread. The African Union has been unable to do anything for its people and the people under its jurisdiction. Lastly, on how they say people are likely to hide war crimes and leave the ICC when there is anti-Western sentiment, which removes like the whistleblowers on the ground. We tell you like 2 things. The first, that war crimes are not things that have to be given out by whistleblowers. War crimes are things that people are going to see, that the media is going to report on. You don't have to be in the place itself. People are likely to want to go and scout out things because of, yes, media wants money, and if they see war crimes, they're going to report on it because sadly, tragedy and devastation breeds like views and like money, viewer counts, and also breeds money for these media companies. We tell you then there is one for whistleblowers. Secondly, then we tell you anti-Western sentiment, although it exists, we tell you how we're going to remove it, right? Edmund already outlined the mechanism in which people would have to work together. People would have to come to a consensus before they were able to make any kinds of ruling in the first place. Secondly, then we've already told you how we're working towards we've already given you a mechanism towards how we're working to like an ICC that is less discriminatory and less selective, in which they would have to listen to the people on the ground, in which they would have to respond to war crimes that are happening beyond just the African Union. Yes.
So you're going to convict people based on media outlets' reports instead of having witness and whistleblowers that tell you that they saw it?
Obviously not. That is not how it's going to happen. They're going to see media reports and they're going to have to investigate it themselves. Even if whistleblowers were to go to the ICC, you wouldn't be immediately prosecuting them like that, right? No, you'd have to go in, investigate the situation, and make sure it was truly a war crime that was being committed before you were able to do anything. If you were going to bring that kind of analysis into this debate, I don't see why the ACC on your side would be able to do anything as well. Secondly, then on what the comparative is on opposition, but the point, like I would like to point out here right now, right? They don't exactly outline to you why the ACC is significantly better than the ICC, beyond the fact that there would be like a lack of anti-Western sentiment, when we've already outlined to you why the ACC is not going to be an arbitrator of justice simply because they don't have like the power and influence that they need to be one. But what is the comparative on opposition then? Number one, participants within the ICC are more likely to be impartial, especially after all the public scrutiny that they have undergone. Like for a few reasons. First world countries like Australia and Canada have a population who are more progressive and care more about protecting human rights. Like for example, the sanctity of life and prosecuting war criminals, and also about being fair. This trend of progressivism and wokeism is one reason why these countries are more likely to be impartial and give out rulings that are actually just and not to have selective justice anymore. This means that they have a local check and balance for country representatives in the ICC, for example, government officials, to want to pursue cases to the fullest extent and to not do it selectively. Secondly, then, we tell you the ICC is also likely to be impartial, especially after all the public scrutiny they have faced, right? The ICC is not blind. The ICC is not stupid. They know this kind of selective justice is not going to work out for them any longer. That is already an incentive for them to stop being so selective with their rulings and court proceedings, so that they be able to actually garner support and to maintain themselves as like an international institution in the first place. Secondly, why participants in the ICC can provide more funding. We've already explained to you pretty well why these they can provide funding, right? Simply because these countries are superpowers who have the funds that they need, and like African cases within the ICC, which lends decisions more and also African cases within the ICC and African officials within the ICC would lend the decisions that the ICC would be ruling out to have more international legitimacy and ensures that justice is better served. Yeah. I'll take your POI.
Yep. Why would richer nations want to convict their own allies if this means that they will lose their economical ability?
But then the same question can be posed to the ACC, right? Why would the ACC want to have justice within the AU if it means it's going to harm their own economy? It is a harm that is symmetric. But here is why it is mitigated on the side of proposition, mainly because the international community, even though it would harm their own economy, they have more people watching them, and especially their own citizens who are more progressive than those, like for example, in Africa, in which they're still caring about like eating food. People who have the agency to be able to care about human rights, they would be holding their own government officials accountable. I don't know if you heard that from just now. But how this also alienates the African Union from the rest of the world, right? For three reasons. One, the hegemony of African powers within court would be likely to like manifest when it comes to the ACC. Why? Because they would like, how would this happen? Because they would form factions based on religion, culture, or around regional powers, for example, wealthier African countries, and they already exist in status quo. Secondly, this means it is harder to resolve inter-faction disputes. It's likely to cause long, drawn-out court proceedings because countries are unwilling to cooperate by delivering the leaders convicted evidence or witnesses. The African Union threat of non-cooperation is less. The African Union's threat of non-cooperation is going to make sure that as the ACC is less powerful when it comes to dishing out justice to those who deserve it. B, it also means when the rest of the world observe this, they think it's unfair because it's not contingent on the first argument. Because insofar any decision undertaken differs from a moral stance from the rest of the world. For example, the punishment is not harsh enough for the rest of the world. Some war crimes that some war crimes that were reported weren't prosecuted. They're likely to have international mistrust. It means it's likely to be different because the kind of principles are likely to be different because the fact that these African Union countries want to pull out from the ICC means that they already have differences in governance. It also means when war crimes and crimes against humanity get unpunished and negotiated away, the rest of the world is going to see it unfold. They're going to be dissatisfied, and they're going to further alienate the African Union from themselves. And the harm is there's less international trust and ties, trust and ties. Trade is not going to be going towards the AU, and even the innocent African countries that are not directly involved are going to have to suffer. For all these reasons, oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that fine speech. I'd now like to invite Proposition Group. Here.
POIs through voice, and then preferred gender pronoun she, her. Setting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The way our proposition is going to win this debate is through one simple clash, and that is effectivity. To compare which side is more effective in terms of holding justice, to compare which side has a more effective court, or which side is better for the people. Now, the problem with our opposition was that they quickly assumed that resources translate to justice. That in order to uphold justice, you need a lot of resources, or in order to uphold justice, you need power. We think this is untrue because the only way to uphold justice is if that organization itself has the incentive to uphold it. If ICC has no incentive to uphold it, that means justice wouldn't be served to begin with. We think that ICC is an organization that is self-interested, that is not benevolent in nature. They have internal interests that they want to serve. I know what Edmund means when he said that it's not controlled by the US, when the ICC is literally funded by the US, when the ICC is literally funded by the West, and the ICC only persecutes African countries. We never see that if the ICC is so benevolent, if the ICC is not by the US, that I'm seeing no reasons why the ICC isn't persecuting the US for war crimes by now, right? Thus, this statement is just not true. We see that ICC is one that doesn't persecute unless it brings them certain benefit. They never proved to us the incentive of the ICC to actually be benevolent in nature, except for a few one-liners that I'll bring up. The first one-liner that Edmund brought up to us was say, because there's going to be backlash, right? We say backlash is not effective by their own analysis per se, because they say that this like ICC have an economical stronghold on these countries, because like these countries can impose sanctions, can have things like trade deals on these countries. By this very analysis, it means that no other countries out there who want to oppose the ICC because of the economic trade deals that they might potentially lose the moment they scrutinize it, the moment they publicize it on media, right? And the second thing Daphne told us was to say, oh, because like people in Australia and Canada are being increasingly progressive, therefore for some reason there were going to be backlash in the ICC, right? We think this is not important, and it's not effective at all, because we say a vast majority of people within these countries just do not care because they have their own issues to deal with, right? This looks like Australia having to deal with the elections, having to deal with oil corporations literally taking over the countries, right? They have their own issues that they have to do with, and they have their own issues that they face on a daily basis that is more important than them, than some African nations that they can't even name in like the middle of nowhere, right? Therefore, in this basis, backlash is likely not going to be effective at all. And if it's true that backlash is not effective, this means that ICC is one that is not effective. The whole case of why ICC is effective false, right? But we further prove to you on why ICC is likely going to be effective for a few reasons. The conclusion here is that the ICC will likely going to be one that's effective and impartial, and will be likely that it's going to be one that has their own incentive. But then they further try to twist this by saying that, oh, but the ICC is getting better, or like, oh, well, but we're having these policies to make the ICC better. I like to post to you, this is not this household motions, and you can't come up with like policies of like what a simple majority out of nowhere, because this house prefers motions. But because of this very conclusion that the West only benefits their own incentive, this means a few things: that the West will only selectively prosecute in a few instances. Number one, when they need to cover up their own war crimes. When there's war crimes like happening in Afghanistan, when they need to cover up war crimes in the Middle East, that's when they start persecuting the African leaders, as we've seen retrospectively. The second thing here, the moment that they will want to prosecute is when they have like incentive to want to probably install a puppet government within the region, like what we've seen like in other like South American countries, right? But lastly, it's also when they want to have a stronghold over the region, because Africa is a country with inherently a lot of coal mines and resources. So the West has an active incentive to want to control over the regions. So they do so by persecuting their leaders, so they can install another leader and get a stronghold, right? It's only because of this few incentive that the ICC will finally act, and the ICC will finally do something about it. But other than that, if they cannot prove to us that the act like ICC is one that's benevolent, we think this incentive stands to the end, right? And we think that there's likely going to be a bias in the system. Yeah, before I move on, I'll take one.
What's the comparative on your side?
Yeah, okay, I'm going on to a comparative. Wait, can you just wait for a while, right? So here's the thing. Then they say on second speaker, they minimize the impact by saying, oh, but we at the very least we have selective justice, and that is still justice, right? That means number one, you're not getting your full impacts that you wanted to frame from first speaker, but we still deal with this. Even if there is justice, we say justice is one that's effective. This was not due. My previous speaker already told you that justice is effective because what the ICC does is that they persecute leaders, they throw leaders into jail, but then they do nothing about it. The people on the ground continue to starve. Conflicts continue when like other coups start to fight to be like leaders of like to take positions of leaders, or like other coups starts to go like to be governments, right? We think this is ineffective in nature because it doesn't benefit the region as a whole. We think the comparative here is very simple. Even we think comparative here is very simple. Even if like we cannot persecute the leaders, right? At the very least, what the AU can do is the AU can have things like negotiations. Yeah, like the AU can have things like negotiations to prevent further war from breaking out, to prevent the issues from further breaking out, or like to implement a leader that is probably more benevolent, or to solve the roots of the problem. We know that AU has an active incentive to do so for the following reasons, and this also proves the effectivity of the AU and why is it that it's likely going to be effective and not like what opposition frames it to be, right? The AU is effective for a few reasons. Because my previous speaker told you that was not responded to, that how the AU works is that it's an interdependent economy. That means the economy is tied to one another. That means they rely on the trade of one another. It looks like one country sells the other country's eggs, and the other country like sells another country's rice, right? They are interdependent. And this scenario, if a country were to break out in war, it means it harms the chain of production of certain countries. Or if a country were to break out of war, right, it actively harms the economy of other countries. Therefore, it's not in the interest of African nations to want to see war break out, or it's not in the interest of African nations to want to see their leaders get persecuted and war to start all again to fight over like the leader positions, right? Therefore, by saying that the African nation has no power, which is untrue, because they can hold each other accountable. Because we think even like the countries themselves, they have the incentive to want to self-regulate so that, like, you know, they don't lose out on economical opportunities, right?
Before 7.
Yeah, I'll take one.
Even if it was an interdependent economy, even though this was happening, right, there were still wars breaking out. How do you then justify this on your side?
Okay, here's what you say. On Edmund's speech and your speech, you're like, oh, but Ethiopia is still happening. The reason why like Ethiopia war is still happening was because the ACC wasn't there by then, right? The ACC is still newly formed. The ACC isn't even formed in status quo right now and still arguing whether or not you want to form. The reason why there is still wars breaking out in the past was because there wasn't any pre-existing code of conduct to regulate this wars or to hold people accountable to begin with, because the ACC weren't formed and ICC is literally doing nothing about it, right? Because ICC is selective bias and ICC only wants selective justice. So in our world, when we finally have the ACC in place, it's more likely that this sort of wars can be regulated in the long run, because at the very least you have code of conduct, you know what to do, like, oh, you should negotiate after the war, you should come to a reconciliation, how you should compensate for the issues, or how you should solve the issues from the root problems. We think it's more effective this way. But then let's further on move on. And then later on they say that, then we also say that this is likely going to be effective because we see the ACC already have an internal interest. If the ACC like didn't care about justice, right, then they wouldn't want to like have the ACC, like the AU didn't care about justice, then they wouldn't have won the ACC in the first place. The reason why they won the ACC is because they know how war has done to the African economy, and they don't want to relapse into the same issues. They don't want to relapse into issues of being in like economical distress, right? And because of these very reasons of not wanting war ever again, it's likely that ACC will be one that's effective in curbing the war, or even in one that helps the African economy as a whole compared to the like ICC. That would be harder to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech. I'd now like to invite the opposition with here.
Hi, I'm just checking my audible.
You're a bit soft. Could you try saying something again?
Hi.
Yeah, it's much better now.
Okay, thank you. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. As a very proud BK student, although I may hate reciting Bible verses, but if BK taught me one thing, it is that in Luke chapter 11, verse 17, Jesus said, any country that divides itself into groups which fight each other will not last very long. A family divided against itself falls apart. Now, before I start my speech, that lock that I have to break, we keep telling you that the ICC is obviously better, but Proud keeps telling you that the ACC is better. They tell you that the ACC will then support itself. You have to realize that, right? The problem is that we never say it won't. We say that they don't have the resources to do so, and you don't see the importance of it because they have their own priorities. I'll respond to this a little bit more later on in my classes. But even so, they never actually tell us why this is so. They never actually tell us why the ACC would be likely to want to support themselves, except for the fact that their economy is interdependent, which I will also talk about later on. But before that, you have to realize, because if it was so much for human rights, then wars wouldn't even exist for personal nations' benefits over the past decade. If Prop really wants to debate on grounds like that, where the ACC can actually work, they need to prove to us why nations in the AU fighting is not because of personal benefits. It's interesting how, though the AU has been established to promote peace and stability, and that they are interdependent, this established institution was unable to do anything for the past 18 years of them being in place. The ICC didn't take charge. The AU was free to solve this issue from the very first place, and they did not. And I think that says enough about the AU for us to tell you that the ACC is not going to work. You have to realize that we tell you the ICC is going to be better because accountability exists on our side better than it exists on the other side of the house. Sure, before this, it wasn't good. Sorry, I'm not going to say before this was. It is said to not be good, right? It is said to be biased, right? But we tell you the difference is that now it is going to be better. As long as I can prove to you that the ICC is bound to do better now because it is heavily scrutinized, so hence it will do better. So you have to also realize, right? Countries in the ICC are smaller countries, not like US or whatnot, right? It depends on superpowers like US for their economy, and you have to realize also then the US listens to its people who care a lot about human rights. If these countries that are in the ICC don't help advocate for human rights, citizens in countries like the US who fight its government, causing the government to set sanctions against these countries in the ICC. These smaller countries cannot afford to do this because their economy is bound to fall. Anyways, you also then have to realize that since it is so heavily scrutinized now, the ICC is bound to do better. Sure, we cannot actually tell you that the ICC is 100% going to do better, but we can still prove to you, insofar as we can prove to you in today's debate, that the ICC is bound to do better than the ACC. We take this debate. Now, before I move on to my clashes, rebuttals, right? Firstly, they talk about how the ICC is biased towards the US and Western powers, whichever country sucks up to them more wins. You have to realize factions that are going to happen on ours. Western powers have more internal check and balances for foreign policy and actions within the ICC. Meaning of worse, this is a wash. At best, we are slightly better. There's no check and balance on AU. AU is filled with weak democracies. Their people have essentially no power. We don't see how it is better on their side of the house. Secondly, talk about how countries have their own issues. Wow, Shaki, I didn't know how that actually exists. You have to also then realize that this is symmetric, right? Like how the shark in both Baby Shark and Shaki. 5 minutes of our speeches told you why countries in the AU fight one another for the sake of their own personal issues. Secondly, you talk about how these countries are interdependent against one another. No, thank you. They talk about, even so, countries having their own issues, right? You have to realize that you need to realize that this is the response you give us. You need to start telling us that all international unions shouldn't, if that is the type of response that you're going to tell us, that these countries have their own personal issues, then you need to start telling us why international unions shouldn't even exist in the first place, because everyone has their own issues anyways. And this actually also wouldn't work, right? Secondly, you talk about how these countries are interdependent with one another for their economy. Shaki, I've always thought you were humorous, but I didn't know you were whole circus. You do have to realize that you need to justify wars over the past decades in the AU. Reason it exists is that you talk about how reasons it exists is that there was no ACC and whatnot, right? You have to realize two things. Firstly, the ICC has no say in such things. Secondly, the AU has a right at it, right? The ACC, even if you tell us that the ACC doesn't exist, therefore it exists, you have to realize the ACC will work under the AU. And insofar as the AU has proven its failure for the past 18 years, we don't see how this can actually work, even if the ACC is in place. Thirdly, new analysis coming in with interesting. They talk about how African countries have incentive to regulate for economical benefit, right? You have to realize African countries don't trade with each other as much. They trade with larger countries that can actually afford the natural resources and labor they can provide. AU's instability and internal schisms, as characterized before, means that other countries are more likely to trust individual African nations rather than the AU as a whole. So there's no incentive for the AU to want to regulate, and even if they did, they have absolutely no resources to do so. A simple summary to what props case in today's debate is two lines. Firstly, ACC is good because ICC is bad. Secondly, ACC will be good because they need to work together. Because they need to work together. We don't see how this can actually stand the debate. Clash of stance, very simple. On Gulf, they tell you ACC is better than ICC because ICC is bad. ICC has a mechanism that are driven by incentives like international scrutiny. Guys, you realize you have to realize, right, that they never actually explain how the ACC is better other than giving you reasons why the ICC is bad, which we all know because of the Infoslide given. Secondly, on out, we told you how the ACC is not better. ACC moves under the AU, which has proven its failure. The ICC, we know that it is biased, but I'll explain to you in the clash of accountability. Points of mechanisms aren't policies. You need to realize that there are just things that are likely to exist. If these mechanisms of accountability didn't exist, no one would even join that. Clash, accountability, effectiveness. Firstly, why the ACC is not bound to be an accountable actor? Firstly, it has never been. We have proven to you this through the past second speakers. Just because I'm well at it, you also have to realize, right, that the ACC is bound to not work as much because firstly, they have already not worked. Secondly, just because the people in the educated does not mean that they're going to be good leaders, right? For example, Donald Trump graduated from UPenn. Is he that good? Not necessarily. Secondly, the second best accountable actor would then be the AU because the ACC is going to move under the AU. But we tell you that the AU sucks. The AU is nothing but selfish. Thirdly, we told you how impartiality in judgment is not achievable on their side of the house for three main reasons. Firstly, the AU does not have any trust to begin with. Secondly, it's already bad. Wars are happening. Thirdly, they have no funds and they have no incentives to actually do things. But the ICC does because of the backlash. Fourth, external relations are going to be tough. Realize then on Gulf, they tell you that the ICC is not going to care about Africa. The ACC is better because ACC can actually care about it firsthand. They can allocate resources better. African countries hold each other accountable, right? We tell you why this is false. We tell you why these countries, if they really wanted to hold each other accountable, if their economy is actually tied to one another, since the AU has already existed for the past few years, then they would have done it, right? They fight already. What's the point of you telling us that the economy is interdependent and they're bound to want to help one another, right? because they have their own interests anyways. Moving on, why the ICC is still the more accountable actor. Little justice is better than no justice. You have to realize this. The AU is not to be biased. It's not itself. When people under the AU die, simply because the AU does not have enough resources, simply because the members of the AU are divided against itself, we don't see how the ACC can be in any way better than the ICC. Secondly, the question is then, how does all prove that ICC can be more accountable? Sure, we cannot prove to you that the ICC is amazing, an angel from God level kind of accountable, but you need to realize then checks and balances exist in the ICC, and especially now that it has international scrutiny. Thirdly, logical response to this would have been, the ICC is comprised of members from a lot of different nations. If the sayings are unjust, the members are unlikely to support it. It has to be unanimous. And you have to realize that backlash can exist. Oh no, I don't have time. Okay, moving on. What comparison? The comparative is that the comparative on what Shakti said on leaders is that leaders in the AU fight against one another for silly, quirky reasons. We don't see how the comparative on their side is better. Insofar as these are the reasons that the ACC is not any better than the ICC oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech. To open up the reply half of the way, I'd like to invite opposition reply. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
You're a bit soft.
Oh, all right. Is this better?
Yep, this is better.
All right, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think the main contention in this debate is whether the ICC or the ACC is more trustworthy, right? There's quite a bit of a deadlock here because both sides are insisting that ICC has these qualities, but ACC also has these qualities, and therefore one is better than the other. Let me just clear that up for you. So here's what Prop said about ACC. They said 4 things. Firstly, shown by the formation of the AU 18 years ago, it proves that African countries want to unite and want to promote peace. I think the key distinction to be made here is that wanting to do something and actually achieving it is completely different. I think when me and Daphne tell you specifically the various examples of how the AU has failed to maintain peace and prosperity within Africa, the reason why the ICC needs to try so many courts and why there's so many cases of war crimes that have to be tried by the ICC, even if they're impartial, simply show that the AU has failed at its mission and that the ACC is not likely going to be better anyways. Second, right, ACC, they say that the ACC is better able to handle local issues because their methods are more locally suited. For example, negotiations. The problem with this is that we've already pointed out to you the reasons why ACC is extremely likely to be biased. But apart from that, right, even if they weren't biased, it's just ineffective to want to negotiate with a war criminal because firstly, they have already caused a lot of damage, and negotiation simply gives more leeway to the war criminal and lessens their punishment and make it so that justice cannot be served. Secondly, negotiating with the criminal only reflects the weakness of the AU in dealing with war criminals instead of arresting or trying them in the first place, right? Because they have to stoop so low instead of taking decisive action. Thirdly, they say that AU countries can hold each other accountable within the ACC. But however, we've already characterized to you specifically, which is also we've also co-opted their characterization a bit when they tell you that, oh, in the international community called ICC, countries that are closest to Western superpowers like Canada or Australia are likely to have more say within the ICC or bias towards them, right? This is even worse in the ACC because of the lack of international actors being able to control the court. They are impartial and do not really and are not the members of the dispute. But apart from that, within the ACC, these exact same hegemonies or triumvirates are going to occur too, because countries are simply going to side with whichever economic power within Africa that has more say or more command within the ACC as well. At worst, this becomes a wash on both sides. At best, at least, we have an edge because we specifically tell you the incentive of countries or of international first world countries that are not in Africa who have populace that can provide backlash and are more aware about societal issues, which makes it more likely for them to take responsible decisions. Fourthly, then, they say that international communities only prosecute African people, and this is principally unjust. So even if they do, but they don't prosecute African people, they prosecute African countries. And you can't say that this is neocolonialism because selective justice still doesn't mean that it's not justice, and this has never been rebutted coming out from DLO, right? These countries are still being punished for the war crimes that they have done, and that in itself is a net benefit, right? What have we told you about the ICC on the other hand then? We told you, for example, the mechanism of first world countries who have a population that is more progressive, right? and that serves as a check and balance, right? But apart from that, ICC has so much more geopolitical influence and funding. This necessarily means that countries are more willing to comply when they send out arrest warrants for war criminals to be tried, or they're trying to enforce their punishments and embargoes on these countries, right? The ACC is not as powerful as the international community. So therefore, the impact of their punishments isn't going to be as strong, and they aren't going to be as effective because of these reasons opposed.
Thank you for that speech. To close up the whole debate, I'd like to invite Proposition 5.
Right. I will first talk about opposition's mistake that tips the tailor towards proposition. Secondly, effectiveness, and thirdly, them stability. Let's go to the first question on why we already won this debate. The question here is that if African nations do not want to regulate human rights at all, opposition never explained how you can ever attain a unanimous decision to prosecute anyone in the first place. This was pointed out in my speech, but was conveniently receiving no response. This means that if they stay true to their model, they can never achieve anything, and all of their impacts on being able to prosecute anyone already false. The tipping point as to why opposition loses this debate is because their model is then unable to exist. Either they have to defend African nations being left out, or if they still want African nations to be able to want to have a unanimous decision before anyone is being able to be prosecuted, this means that they are unable to prosecute anyone. If that is the case, the tipping point as to why we win is because we've explained why on our side of the house, if on both sides no one can prosecute anyone anyway, we have two things. Firstly, you have less anti-West sentiments towards human rights as a whole. This means that countries can work towards human rights a bit more. They can also talk about human rights a bit more without having voter backlash. Secondly, assuming no one gets prosecuted anyway, the only chance to be able to table these issues within a platform with all African nations is on our side of the house, when then you are less likely to get prosecuted, or when you do not have so much scrutiny, or when all of the discussion on side of opposition will be centered around international narratives, whereas on our side of the house, they will be more specific and tailored to the African nations. This is really important and debate winning, because opposition never answered the question or clarified their model in all of their speeches. This means that if both sides of the house are unable to prosecute, this means that it is more important to be able to move on, at least for a bit, instead of achieving no delta at all on side of opposition. With that being said, I think this already wins us the debate. This is the crucial mistake that opposition did. Secondly, then, let's be charitable and take them at their best and talk about effectiveness, assuming they can actually prosecute someone. We tell you that the winning tangent is on whistleblowers. Opposition says that the media will report anyway, but they ignore the analysis that people are against the ICC. People have no interest in knowing what crimes the leaders had done based on this evil international court that is against this African people. They never explain why the media will report this in the first place. However, we think that you are then unable to convict on their sense. They say that you can just go based on the media and just go investigate on these people. Sure, but you still need witnesses unless you have a CCTV everywhere within these war zones, even if at their best case that media want to report this, which is then against what people want to see, you're still unable to convict anyone. So by then, the buy-in of individuals on the ground are the most crucial factors in able to prosecuting anyone in the first place, unless opposition wants to defend prosecuting someone without legit evidence and without legit witnesses. This is the second reason as to why opposition already loses out within this debate. The comparative here is that this is seen as a local effort in promoting peace. It is already happening and is in progress. It is seen as a lack of nationalism, which is why it's so much easier to achieve that on our side of the house. With that being said, I think this is the second independent reason as to why we win. Thirdly then, let's go even further to talk about stability. Opposition in their absolute last minute say that you will be alienated from the world, but they do not answer our question of like, if African nations are not, like if other nations are not getting punished in the first place, then the logic doesn't run, because you can't say that it is unfair. We've told you from first speech that other nations are not getting punished, so technically other nations do not have harm. But what then we've told you is even more important, because we've told you that the impartiality is a massive habit when it divides people on the ground. It is even worse on their side of the house when people have diverse opinions on whether their leaders should be taken out or not, compared to on our side, maybe you have a division due to whether the existence of court should exist or not. This means that we explain firstly the mechanism more than opposition, and secondly, we explain the likelihood of having factions, because some people believe that their leaders should go in jail and some believe that they should not. This is more likely to achieve a civil war compared to the unexplained harm that exists on side of opposition. On that basis of these three reasons, we urge you to stand on side of proposition.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech. The debate has now come to a close. I'd like to invite both teams to virtually cross the floor and shake hands. So what will happen is that because this is an out round, I won't be able to tell you the verdict here. So judges, if you can move to the Discord, one of the Discord rooms to discuss the verdict, that'll be great.
Thanks for the debate.
Thanks for the debate.
Thank you.
Judges, let's meet in room 1.